With calloused hands clutching the deed and a worn photograph of her late father, Abigail Fletcher gazed up at the weathered facade of the Oakridge Post Office. She had spent her last $400 buying this abandoned property at a county auction. Desperate for both a fresh start and additional storage space after losing part of her family farm to crushing agricultural debts. Little did she know that hidden beneath the warped floorboards lay a Civil War general's battle plans, a discovery that would not only change her life forever, but would thrust her into a dangerous game between determined historians, corrupt collectors, and powerful institutions who had kept the secret buried for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early April rain tapped gently against the cracked windows. As Abigail followed County Administrator Samantha Wilson across the dusty wooden floor of what was now her property. The once bustling Oakridge Post Office had been the communication hub of Hartland County. Its modest lobby and sorting room had connected the rural community to the outside world for over a century. Now, after sitting vacant for nearly 5 years, it stood as a hollow shell of its former self, a testament to rural decline and changing communication methods. Her mud-caked boots echoed on the pine floor, now dulled by years of abandonment. Cobwebs stretched between ornate ceiling fixtures, and the once gleaming counter was blanketed in a thick layer of dust. Faded posters peeled in corners where water. Damage had taken its toll, and the lingering scent of old paper and ink mingled with mustiness and decay. As I mentioned during the auction, the property is being sold as is, Samantha said, her voice bouncing off the high ceiling. Oakridge Post Office closed in 2019 after the Postal Service consolidated rural routes. The county seized it for back taxes 2 years ago. Honestly, we're just happy someone's taking it off our hands. Abigail nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. Just 8 months ago, she had been managing the modest but stable Fletcher family farm, continuing the legacy her father had built over 40 years. Then came the drought, the failed crops, the equipment breakdowns, and finally the devastating bank loan that threatened to take everything. The creditors had already claimed the north field, her best tractor, and were eyeing the main farmhouse. Next, the location isn't terrible, Samantha continued, trying to sound encouraging. Downtown Oakridge has seen better days, but there's talk of revitalization. The former postmaster's apartment above the main room might be habitable with some. Work and the utilities are still connected? Abigail asked, running her hand along a dusty sorting table that once held countless letters and packages. Water and electric are still connected to the grid, though you'll need to set up accounts. The plumbing might need work. Buildings this. Old always do. She hesitated. Look, I know you got this place for a steal, but are you sure about this? A woman alone in an abandoned building in a struggling downtown area. Abigail straightened her back. I've repaired farm equipment, restored ancient barns, and managed 100 acres on my own since my father passed. I've worked with my hands my whole life, and after what I've been through this past year, an old post office doesn't scare me. And this is what I can afford. What she didn't say was that her farm's income had been depleted by equipment repairs and loan payments. The small town of Oakridge, just 30 minutes from her struggling farm, offered the only property she could afford. This forgotten post office, purchased for less than the price of a decent set of tires for her truck. Samantha handed her a ring of brass keys. Main entrance, sorting room access, mail slots, and these smaller ones for various cabinets. The basement storage is beneath the east side. Probably best to keep that locked. Some of the old records and equipment are still down there. Abigail took the keys, her trained eye noticing the distinctive Postal Service markings on several of them. Thank you. I can manage from here. Take your time looking around. I have other appointments, so I'll head out. County office is open weekdays if you need anything. Samantha seemed relieved to leave, the emptiness of the post office clearly making her uncomfortable. Alone in what would become both her storage space and her fresh start, Abigail moved through the cavernous main room like a farmer assessing a new field. The empty sorting tables with their built-in slots still intact. The small office with its dusty reference manual still in place. The mail processing area with its specialized equipment still bolted to tables. Her experienced eyes saw past the decay to the building's bones, solid, practical, built to last. The ornate woodwork, the pine floors, the tall windows with their elaborate frames, all treasures waiting to be restored by someone who understood their value. She made her way to the upper level and the postmaster's former apartment, a surprisingly spacious four-room residence with large windows overlooking the town square. The furniture was gone, but the fixtures remained. A clawfoot tub in the bathroom, built-in shelves in what had once been a study, and what appeared to have been a small repair shop for postal equipment. With cleaning and minor repairs, it could be livable within days. As she stood by the window, watching rain cascade down the ornate glass, Abigail felt the weight of the past year pressing down on her, the devastating drought that had come without warning, the grueling months of trying to save dying crops, the heartbreaking realization that nothing would save her north field, and finally the cold business of settling debts that had stripped away what remained of her father's legacy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her phone chimed with an incoming call. The screen showed Hartland Agricultural Bank, her lender. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest, but she quickly suppressed it. They had made their position clear when she had requested an extension on her equipment loan. "Abigail Fletcher speaking," she answered, keeping her voice professional. "Miss Fletcher, it's Manager Browning." The bank manager's voice was as formal as ever. "I'm just checking in. Johnson mentioned you'd purchased property, and where was it?" "Oakridge," Abigail replied. "Yes, I've purchased the old post office here. I'm standing in it right now." "Oakridge? Isn't that where that historical controversy happened during the bicentennial? What on earth possessed you to move there?" Abigail didn't mention that her financial struggles, considered a personal failure by many of her fellow farmers, had effectively ended her standing in the agricultural community. Browning himself had suggested she consider other career paths, rather than throwing good money after bad with her struggling farm. "It's a practical decision," Abigail said neutrally. "The property has potential. Good bones, lots of space for equipment storage." "Well," Browning's voice held a note of condescension, "when you're ready to be reasonable about selling the remaining acreage, let me know. We could possibly find a buyer more suitable for managing a property of that size." After ending the call, Abigail let out a long breath, fighting back the anger that threatened to boil over. From respected farmer and county fair blue ribbon winner to being pushed towards selling her family legacy, all because forces beyond her control had conspired against her livelihood. As the afternoon light began to fade, Abigail made her way to the east side of the building. She hadn't yet explored the most intriguing feature of her new property, the basement storage. Following the main corridor to the rear of the building, she found a narrow staircase leading to the lower level. The temperature dropped noticeably as she descended. Unlike the rest of the post office, the basement showed no signs of water damage or significant deterioration. Its concrete walls and floors had been built to withstand the passage of time and the specific requirements of postal record preservation. Abigail flipped a switch, surprised when fluorescent fixtures flickered to life overhead. The storage area dominated the space. Rows of metal shelving units, flat file drawers for documents, specialized cabinets for packages and fragile items. As a farm owner responsible for maintaining detailed agricultural records, Abigail had experience with storage systems. But there was something uniquely interesting about standing in a space where decades of community communications had been processed and preserved. On the far wall, partially concealed behind a large storage cabinet, she noticed something unexpected. What appeared to be a door, its outline barely visible beneath multiple coats of paint. "Now that's interesting," she murmured, examining the hidden entrance. She pushed the heavy cabinet aside, revealing a small safe-like door with a sophisticated mechanical dial that still showed signs of regular maintenance. It appeared to be government-grade, suggesting this hidden room had been part of the post office's design during its connection to military communications during wartime. But why would a small rural post office need a high-security safe? Valuable documents, perhaps, or something else entirely. Abigail checked her watch. Too late to do anything more today. She needed to bring her belongings from the farm, purchase cleaning supplies, and begin making the apartment habitable. The basement. Storage mysteries would have to wait. That night, lying on a sleeping bag in what would become her bedroom, Abigail scrolled through her phone, researching Oakridge Post Office. Most articles focused on its operational history, serving the region from 1870 until its closure in 2019. One detail caught her attention. During the Civil War era, the post office had been unofficially connected to Union Army communications, serving as a temporary repository for sensitive documents being studied before their transfer to military headquarters. One paragraph mentioned an incident in 1876 that had led to the post office being temporarily closed for inventory review. Though details were sparse, the postmaster at that time, Colonel James Whitaker, had apparently worked closely with federal authorities during the review. His name appeared in several historical accounts about a controversial battle near Chancellorsville. Civil War connections, Abigail whispered to herself, her curiosity piqued. Could the floor safe in the basement be related to the Union Army program? If the safe had remained sealed since the post office's closure, might it still contain materials from that era? Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams vivid and unsettling, standing before the safe as its door slowly swung open, revealing shelves of ancient documents marked with military seals and catalog numbers. She woke at dawn, that dream so real. She half expected to find yellowed battle maps clutched in her hands. After a simple breakfast, Abigail drove to the local hardware store, purchasing cleaning supplies, basic tools, and a locksmith's handbook. If the basement safe had a still functional dial, her experience repairing farm equipment might help her bypass the lock system. The morning passed in a flurry of cleaning, sweeping decades of dust from the apartment, scrubbing fixtures, wiping windows to let in more light. By afternoon, exhausted but satisfied, Abigail returned her attention to the basement safe. The mechanical dial offered little immediate help. The system was sophisticated and clearly designed to prevent tampering. She tried several likely combinations, with no success. Think logically, she told herself, applying her problem-solving mindset. What combination might the military have used? Dates of significance, the facility's opening, standard military sequences. As she worked, an elderly man appeared at the post office's front entrance, peering through the glass doors. Abigail approached cautiously. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man smiled warmly, his weathered face mapping decades under the Midwestern sun. "Name's Robert Wilson. Heard someone finally bought the old Oakridge Post Office. Thought I'd welcome you to the community." Abigail introduced herself instinctively, liking the old man's genuine manner. "I worked here, you know," Robert said, gazing around the dusty foyer with misty eyes. 33 years as head of distribution. Started just after the military partnership was established in '62. Those were interesting days for Oakridge. "The military partnership?" Abigail asked, excitement rising. The program had been mentioned in her research. Robert nodded. With the Union Army's Communications Department. Fascinating program, officially just a mail delivery service, but they were coordinating some remarkable operations. Battle plans that changed the course of the war. Were you here during the incident in 1876? Abigail asked. Robert's expression darkened. Bad business, that. Inventory discrepancies of some kind. Federal officials everywhere for weeks. Colonel Whitaker nearly lost his position trying to contain whatever happened. This revelation sent Abigail's mind racing. Mr. Wilson, there's a safe in the basement storage. Would you know anything about it? Robert's eyes widened. You found that? The secure vault? He lowered his voice, though no one else was around. That was Colonel Whitaker's private facility. Called it his verification room. I never knew what was inside. Only the colonel and his deputy had access. The safe is still locked. I have keys to the storage area, but not the combination to the mechanical dial. Robert thought for a moment. Well, for the storage, we always use the post office's founding date as the master key minus 1870. But the secure room, that would have been something military, known only to Whitaker and his people. Abigail's heart raced. This was exactly the kind of historical detail she needed. Would you mind if I tried some combinations while you're here? Maybe you'll remember something that helps. Together, they moved to the basement storage. Robert visibly brightened as they entered. My goodness, this takes me back, he said, running his hand along a sorting table. Kept this place immaculate for nearly 4 decades. Mail distribution is no place for cutting corners. Abigail examined the dial more carefully in Robert's presence. It's a 6-digit sequence, most likely. Any idea what Colonel Whitaker might have used? Whitaker was obsessed with General Grant, Robert recalled. Date of his victory at Vicksburg was like a religion to him. July 4, 1863 to 070463. That victory changed everything for the Union campaign. Abigail carefully turned the dial to the sequence, 070463. She held her breath as the last number aligned. A small click sounded from within the mechanism, but the safe remained sealed. Worth a try, Robert sighed. Whitaker must have used something else. As Robert prepared to leave, he paused thoughtfully. You know, there was something odd after the 1876 incident. Whitaker became fixated on verification protocols. Started keeping his own records separate from official channels. Became convinced that someone inside the Army was working against legitimate Union claims. This piqued Abigail's professional interest. What kind of records? Battle plans, authentication reports, field logs, things the Army sent but weren't included in the official postal catalog. Whitaker believed the 1876 discrepancy was connected to something bigger, something involving people high up in the military world, but he could never prove it. After Robert left, Abigail couldn't stop thinking about the safe and Colonel Whitaker's unofficial investigation. If Whitaker had indeed kept hidden files on an inventory discrepancy that was never fully explained, those documents could be of significant historical value and potentially explosive if they implicated people who had escaped accountability. That evening, as wind rattled the post office's old windows, Abigail researched the 1876 incident and the Oakridge Post Office's connection to the Union Army. Historical accounts describe the inventory review following procedural irregularities. At the post office, the Army had pursued an internal investigation but had never released findings. The case had gone quiet in 1877 when Colonel Whitaker was reassigned to a Western frontier position, and the post office continued operations under new leadership. Until funding cuts forced its closure in 2019. One detail stood out. The lead authentication expert assigned to the investigation was Lieutenant Samuel Whitaker, the colonel's son. This family connection explained the post office's involvement, but also raised questions. Had the Whitakers discovered something They couldn't safely reveal? Something now locked in the basement safe? Could it be that simple? Abigail murmured. Moving back to the safe, she tried a new combination, the date of the inventory discrepancy, which she had found mentioned in an article about the Army investigation, April 12, 1876, 041276. The mechanism remained unyielding, frustrated but not defeated. Abigail spent the next day settling into her new home. A local second-hand store provided basic furniture, a real bed, a table, chairs. She met several neighbors, all curious about the newcomer who had bought the old post office. "Place is probably filled with old secrets," commented one elderly woman at the grocery store, eyeing Abigail with concern. "Not sure I'd want to live there alone." Returning to the post office that afternoon, Abigail was surprised to find a sleek black car parked outside. A man in an expensive suit stood at the entrance, checking his watch impatiently. "Miss Fletcher," he called as Abigail approached. "Victor Reynolds, representing Heritage Development Group. I understand you've recently acquired this property." Abigail nodded cautiously, unlocking the door. "Just 4 days ago." Reynolds followed her inside without waiting for an invitation. "Our company specializes in repurposing historical properties for commercial use. We've had our eye on this post office for some time, but missed the auction notice. I'm authorized to offer you $60,000, a substantial profit on your investment." The offer was tempting enough to pay off her equipment loan and provide a financial cushion while she rebuilt her farm's operations. But something felt off about Reynolds' eagerness. "I'm not interested in selling," Abigail said firmly. "I've just moved in." Reynolds' smile tightened. "Perhaps I wasn't clear. This property requires significant renovation to be commercially viable. The cost would far exceed what his eyes flicked to Abigail's mud-stained work boots and second-hand jacket. "Person in your situation could manage. Our offer is quite generous. Nevertheless, I decline." Reynolds reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "Think it over. Our offer expires in 48 hours. After that, we'll be pursuing other opportunities in Hartland County." After he left, Abigail examined the card. Heritage Development Group had a Washington, D.C. address, a connection that seemed unlikely to be coincidental. Why would an East Coast developer be interested in an abandoned post office in rural Kentucky? What had changed to make this property suddenly valuable? That night, unable to sleep, Abigail returned to the basement safe. Something about Reynolds' visit had unsettled her. If the post office itself was valuable to developers, why had it sat empty for nearly 5 years? What had changed? On impulse, she tried another combination. The date the post office had closed, September 30, 2019, 093019. The dial's mechanism remained frozen. Abigail ran her hand through her hair in frustration. She was missing something. What would a military man like Whitaker use for a truly secure facility? A memory surfaced from her time working with a historical society on a farm preservation project, something about significant Civil War dates. She quickly searched on her phone. Appomattox Courthouse surrender date. With renewed hope, she entered 040965, April 9, 1865, when General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. A small click sounded. Something inside the mechanism released. Abigail's heart pounded as she pulled the heavy door. Slowly, the safe swung open. The smell hit her first musty paper, old metal, leather. Her farmer's instincts registered the odor of materials long sealed away from light and fresh air. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw shelves lining the small safe, filled with file folders, leather-bound journals, and what appeared to be authentication certificates. And in the center on a small desk sat a leather portfolio marked with faded military insignia and a simple label, General Thomas Crawford Southern Campaign Restricted Access. Abigail's hands trembled as she approached it. General Crawford? She'd never heard of this general. As someone who had studied local Civil War history for years, she understood the potential significance of her discovery. If these were Colonel Whitaker's unofficial files on the inventory discrepancy, they could contain information never included in the official investigation, possibly even evidence identifying the previously unknown Union general whose existence had been suppressed for decades. Carefully, using the precision ingrained from years of handling fragile farm records, Abigail opened the leather portfolio. Inside were dozens of hand-drawn maps showing battle formations, troop movements, and what appeared to be strategic plans for a campaign whose details matched none in the established historical record. One document caught her eye, a detailed battle plan on aged parchment, dated to approximately June 1863, showing what appeared to be a hidden Union operation located in a previously unexplored area near the Confederate capital. Unlike the official suspects mentioned in historical accounts of a minor inventory discrepancy, this map suggested something far more significant: the potential discovery of an unknown Union general deliberately erased from military records. "My God," Abigail whispered, understanding the implications. Colonel Whitaker had discovered evidence of a general removed from history, perhaps explaining why the case was downplayed and never resolved. As she carefully examined the documents, a folded paper fell from between two folders. Unlike the official military documents, this appeared to be a personal letter handwritten on ordinary paper. It was dated September 15, 1877, the month before Whitaker's reassignment to the frontier. "Dear Samuel," it began, "with my transfer to the Western Territories, our verification of General Crawford is officially terminated. The department has ordered all materials returned to Washington, but I cannot in good conscience surrender the evidence we've gathered implicating Caldwell military suppliers and their operatives within our research team. Captain Davis died believing we were close to proving this general's existence. His accident only confirms our suspicions. As discussed, these documents must remain sealed. The evidence is compelling but circumstantial, and Caldwell's influence extends to the highest levels of government and the military establishment. Perhaps in 50 years, when his protections have faded, the truth can emerge. Until then, I trust your discretion. Dad." Abigail sat back, overwhelmed by the implications. Colonel Whitaker had deliberately preserved evidence of a potentially unknown Union general, hiding it in the post office's secure room when the official investigation was shut down, perhaps after the suspicious death of another researcher. And somehow these files had remained sealed away, forgotten after the military partnership ended, undisturbed after the post office's closure. The question that burned in Abigail's mind: what had happened to Caldwell military suppliers and those implicated in these documents? As if in answer, she found a newspaper clipping dated 2017. Former defense contractor CEO Alexander Caldwell dies at 92. The obituary described him as a champion of military history who had served in government before founding Caldwell Defense Systems, which he led for 3 decades before retiring to Washington, D.C. in 1997. More importantly, it listed his only surviving family member, grandson Victor Caldwell, who had returned to government service in 2018 as Deputy Director of Historical Preservation after leading the family company for 20 years. The pieces began to fall into place. Victor Reynolds was likely connected to Victor Caldwell, representing a company suddenly interested in acquiring the post office where evidence of his grandfather's crimes might be hidden. Abigail's protective instinct surged within her. These documents represented crucial evidence in a serious case of historical suppression. A potentially unknown Union general deliberately hidden from history because powerful people had prioritized profit over historical truth. These files didn't belong hidden away or destroyed to protect reputations. They belonged in the hands of proper authorities who could finally address a decades-old betrayal of military ethics. As she carefully returned the documents to their portfolio, Abigail heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The main door of the post office opening. Heavy footsteps echoed through the lobby, approaching the stairs to the basement storage. Abigail froze, her mind racing. It was nearly midnight. No legitimate visitor would arrive unannounced. Quickly, she closed the leather portfolio and looked for a place to hide it. The safe had a small floor compartment embedded in one corner, likely used for the most sensitive materials when the post office was operational. She carefully placed the portfolio inside, closed it, then moved to the storage door. Through the partially open door, she could see two people descending the stairs. One was Victor Reynolds, his expensive suit now replaced with dark, practical clothing. The other was a stranger, older, military-bearing, expression grim. "I'm telling you, Director, someone's opened the safe," Reynolds was saying. "The security system registered dial movement an hour ago." "Then where are the files?" the older man demanded. "You assured me they'd be here undisturbed." "No one knows what they are," Reynolds insisted. "Even if this farmer found them, she wouldn't understand their significance." Abigail's heart hammered in her chest. They knew exactly what the safe contained and had been monitoring the building, waiting for someone to solve the puzzle they couldn't. Now they wanted to ensure whatever was found remained buried forever. Making a split-second decision, Abigail quietly closed the storage door from inside, turning the key in the lock. The solid click echoed in the confined space. Outside, she heard Reynolds' startled exclamation. "The storage, it's locked." Footsteps rushed toward the door, followed by the handle turning vigorously. "We need the key," the director barked. "I have a master set," Reynolds replied. "But it will take time to find the right one." Abigail assessed her situation. The storage room was secure for the moment, but had only one exit. Her phone showed no signal in the basement's thick walls. However, as a practical woman who had spent her life working in old buildings, she knew that facilities of this era often had multiple access points for safety purposes. Scanning the room carefully, she noticed a small service hatch near the floor in one corner, partially hidden by a storage unit. It would likely lead to maintenance tunnels or utility conduits. She moved the unit aside, revealing a hatch just large enough for a person to crawl through. The rusted hinges protested as she pulled it open, revealing a narrow tunnel that appeared to lead toward the back of the property. Outside the storage door, she could hear Reynolds trying various keys, getting closer to finding the right one. Abigail grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the passage. Decades of cobwebs hung from the low ceiling, but the tunnel itself seemed structurally sound. With no other choice, she crawled inside, pulling the small hatch closed. Behind her, the passage was tight and dusty, clearly unused for many years. Abigail moved as quickly as she could, ignoring the spider webs that clung to her hair and clothing. Behind her, she heard the storage door open, followed by Reynolds. Curse when he discovered Abigail wasn't inside. The tunnel extended about 50 feet before ending at another small hatch. Abigail pushed it open cautiously, emerging into an overgrown area behind the post office near an old loading dock. From this hidden position, she could see Reynolds and the man he'd called Director exiting the main building, flashlights sweeping the property as they searched for her. Abigail remained motionless, barely breathing as they passed within feet of her hiding place. Their voices carried clearly in the night air. "She must have found another way out," Reynolds said, frustration evident in his tone. "Find her," the older man ordered, "and the files." Abigail took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. Some buildings held more than their apparent purpose within their walls. Some held secrets that demanded to be revealed, no matter how long they had waited in darkness. For Abigail Fletcher, The journey that had begun in drought and financial ruin had led to an unexpected purpose, becoming the voice for a truth that could no longer be silenced. As Abigail stepped from Dr. Morgan's vehicle, her eyes locked on the post office silhouette against the night sky. The property that had represented her last chance at a fresh start now stood at the center of a 150-year-old military cover-up investigation. Yellow police tape cordoned off the entrance while uniformed deputies secured the perimeter, their flashlight beams cutting through darkness that seemed to hold more than just shadows. "Two of my associates are inside," Dr. Morgan explained, guiding Abigail toward the entrance. "I've told them to secure the storage room, but touch nothing until we arrive." Deputy James Wilson flanked Abigail's other side, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "The Caldwells have friends throughout government circles," he warned. "Word travels fast in the defense world." The post office's interior felt different under the harsh beams of police, flashlights less a potential home and more a crime scene. Their footsteps echoed across the pine floor as they moved toward the basement storage stairs. Abigail's heart pounded with each step downward, the temperature dropping as they descended into the space where she had made her discovery. Two people in State Historical Society jackets stood at attention outside the storage room, nodding respectfully. As Dr. Morgan approached, "Any disturbances?" Morgan asked. "No, ma'am," the senior associate replied, "but we've had 3 calls from the National Military Heritage Foundation in the last hour. Diana Caldwell is claiming this falls under federal jurisdiction. Says we're interfering with national security agreements by securing the site." "This is my jurisdiction," Morgan said firmly, "and potential evidence of historical fraud committed here falls under my purview until proven otherwise." Inside the storage room, Abigail showed them the safe, still open from her hasty departure. The leather portfolio with the General Crawford documents remained in the floor compartment where she had hidden it. "This is what I found," she explained carefully, removing the portfolio and placing it on a preservation table. "Colonel Whitaker's personal records of the 1876 authentication dispute." Dr. Morgan pulled on conservation gloves before opening the portfolio. As she examined the contents, her expression grew increasingly serious. "These are authentic military documents," she confirmed. "And if what they allege is true, we're looking at historical fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and possibly murder." James examined Colonel Whitaker's letter. He specifically names Alexander Caldwell and mentions a Captain Davis who died in an accident while investigating. "We should look into Davis's death." "Already on it," Morgan nodded. "I've requested the file from military archives, but we need to move these documents to secure storage immediately. The longer they remain here, the greater the risk." As they carefully repacked the evidence, a deputy rushed into the storage room. "Dr. Morgan, we've got a situation. 3 black SUVs just pulled up, federal plates. They're demanding immediate access to the site." Morgan's expression hardened. "Tell them this is an active investigation under State Historical Society jurisdiction. No one enters without my authorization." "They're claiming federal security override," the deputy said. "The lead agent has a document signed by the Secretary of Defense." "Convenient timing," James muttered. "Too convenient," Morgan agreed. "This goes higher than we thought." She turned to Abigail. "We need to get you and this evidence out of here now. There's a back exit through the maintenance tunnels. It comes out behind the old loading dock." "I know it," Abigail confirmed. "That's how I escaped earlier." "Perfect." Morgan handed the leather portfolio to James. "Deputy Wilson, escort Miss Fletcher and the evidence to my personal vehicle. It's parked behind the east wing. Take the tunnel and avoid being seen. Drive directly to the State Museum and secure this in the conservation lab. I've already alerted the board chair. He's waiting to witness the chain of custody. What about you?" James asked. "I'll handle our visitors," Morgan said grimly. "Buy you time to get clear." If these documents are what they appear to be, a lot of powerful people will go to extraordinary lengths to make them disappear. As Abigail and James prepared to leave through the maintenance tunnel, Morgan placed a hand on Abigail's shoulder. "What you've discovered could change Civil War historiography, Ms. Fletcher. The truth about General Crawford has been buried for too long." Abigail nodded, the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. "I just wanted a place to store my farm equipment. I never expected this." "Sometimes we don't find our purpose," Morgan replied. "Sometimes it finds us." The maintenance tunnel was as dark and cramped as Abigail remembered. She led the way, James following closely behind with the leather portfolio clutched to his chest. They moved silently, conscious of voices echoing from the main level of the post office. "Deanna Caldwell is up there," James whispered. "I recognize her voice from county fundraisers." "She wants these files destroyed," Abigail replied. "They prove her father and grandfather suppressed the discovery of an unknown Union general. They faked authentication reports and falsified battle plans. They reached the exit hatch, pushing it open carefully. The night air felt cool after the stuffiness of the tunnel. In the distance, they could see the flashing lights of government vehicles by the main entrance. "Dr. Morgan's car is just beyond those trees," James said. "Stay low and follow me." Moving through shadows, they reached Morgan's unmarked vehicle. James unlocked it and placed the leather portfolio in a hidden compartment beneath the rear seat. "The State Museum is 30 minutes away," he explained, starting the engine. "The board chair is a former investigator for the Historical Crimes team. He understands the significance of what we found." As they drove away from the post office, Abigail glanced back at the property she had purchased just 5 days earlier. Police lights still flashed at the entrance, silhouetting figures engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Her simple hope for affordable storage space had uncovered one of the most significant historical suppressions in American military history evidence that had remained hidden for 150 years, protected by a postmaster who had sacrificed his career to preserve the truth. "Your life is going to change after tonight," James said quietly. "Once these documents are properly secured and authenticated, everything changes. The Caldwells, their defense business, their government connections, it all comes under scrutiny." Abigail nodded, watching the Kentucky landscape pass by in darkness. Maybe that's what Colonel Whitaker was counting on. Someone with nothing left to lose. Someone who would recognize the importance of what he left behind. The State Museum stood illuminated against the night sky, its modernist architecture a stark contrast to Oakridge's classical post office. Dr. Harold Winters waited on the steps, his expression grave. "Bring it inside quickly," he instructed. As they approached, "I've cleared the conservation lab of all personnel except my most trusted technician. Whatever you found, I want an unbroken chain of custody documented." In the laboratory, James carefully placed the leather portfolio on the examination table. "This contains documentary evidence related to General Thomas Crawford. Evidence of historical fraud and conspiracy at the highest levels of the military establishment." Dr. Winters, a former prosecutor himself, examined the documents with practiced efficiency. His expression darkened as he read Colonel Whitaker's letter. "I studied James Whitaker's career," he said finally. "Wrote my dissertation on Civil War postal communications. One of the most meticulous military minds of the Reconstruction era. If he preserved these records at great personal risk, he believed they were vital to historical integrity." The judge looked at Abigail with new respect. "You purchased the post office 5 days ago, Miss Fletcher?" "Yes, sir. It was all I could afford after losing part of my farm. And now you've uncovered what may be evidence of one of the most significant historical cover-ups in American military history. The Caldwells will fight to bury this again. That family has tremendous influence in defense circles. What happens now?" Abigail asked. "I'm declaring these materials evidence in a potential criminal investigation," Winters stated. "They'll be placed in the museum's secure storage tonight. Tomorrow, I'll contact the National Historical Association's Ethics Committee. This needs to be handled at the highest levels by people with no connections to the Caldwell family." As they completed the necessary documentation to establish the chain of custody, Dr. Morgan arrived looking battle-worn, but satisfied. "Diana Caldwell is furious," she reported. "But I stood my ground on jurisdiction." Her phone rang, and she stepped away to answer it. When she returned, her expression was grim. "Diana Caldwell is requesting a temporary restraining order against our investigation," she announced after ending the call. Her attorneys are claiming these artifacts are protected by national security protocols and must be immediately returned to the Department of Defense without further examination. "The Department of Defense doesn't even know they exist," James protested. "That's the whole point. The Caldwells made sure of it." "FBI agents are securing the scene," Morgan continued. "But Victor Caldwell arrived with a team of attorneys before they could complete their initial assessment. They're claiming some materials are protected by military confidentiality and cannot be examined without Pentagon approval." The implications were clear. The Caldwells were already constructing their narrative, attempting to use national security regulations and military protocols to regain control of evidence that could destroy their family legacy and the fortune built on suppressing an unknown general's existence. "I need to get to the State Museum's legal department," Morgan said. "If they're filing for restraining orders, this goes even deeper than we thought." "Go," Dr. Winters agreed. "My team will continue here. We have more than enough to proceed, regardless of what happens with Diana Caldwell's legal maneuvering." As Morgan departed, Abigail found herself drawn to a small metal container tucked behind the artifact storage. Different from the others, more personal in nature. Inside were photographs of Colonel Whitaker and his son Samuel as young men working at a military outpost, letters between the two, and a handwritten journal with entries spanning decades. The journal revealed the personal cost of the Whitakers' secret investigation. James's wife had left him in 1877, unable to understand his obsession with the authentication dispute. Samuel had been passed over for promotion repeatedly, his career stalling as he continued to quietly pursue the General Crawford case against his commander's orders. Both men had sacrificed everything: family, career, advancement, personal happiness, to preserve evidence they believed would someday protect historical integrity. "They never gave up," Abigail said softly, showing the journal to James. "Even when it cost them everything." "Some truths are worth any price," James replied, his expression solemn. They understood that the evidence they were protecting wasn't just about exposing one authentication fraud. It was about revealing corruption at the heart of the military establishment, about breaking the power of people who believed their profits mattered more than historical accuracy. By mid-afternoon, the State Museum's evidence recovery team had documented and secured the contents of the hidden collection. News of Diana Caldwell's legal maneuvers had broken nationally, with conflicting reports about whether the courts would intervene in the investigation. Victor Caldwell had appeared briefly before cameras, expressing outrage at what he called historical persecution and denying any family involvement in suppressing military evidence. Abigail watched the press conference on a tablet, noting the younger Caldwell's practiced delivery and carefully constructed statements. This was a man accustomed to controlling narratives, to being believed simply because of his position and family name. But the evidence from the post office told a different story, one of multi-generational fraud and brutal elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. "He's good," Dr. Winters observed. "Sympathetic, dignified, appropriately indignant. If we didn't have the evidence, people would believe him just as they have for decades." "The power of position and reputation," Abigail finished. Winters nodded. "It's why this case went unsolved for so long." Who would believe that America's most prominent defense contractor was erasing generals from history while simultaneously being celebrated for preserving military heritage? Dr. Morgan returned from the State Museum late that evening, her expression thunderous. The judge rejected Caldwell's restraining order. The evidence was too compelling, too meticulously preserved by Whitaker. But Diana Caldwell isn't giving up. She's appealing to the federal level, claiming national security implications because of military confidentiality agreements. The pattern was becoming clear. The Caldwells were attempting to use bureaucratic and legal means to delay the investigation, buying time to construct a defense and perhaps destroy any additional evidence that might exist elsewhere. As night approached, Abigail found herself standing in what had once been the post office's main lobby, a quiet space now transformed by the bustling investigation. The large windows caught the setting sun, casting golden light across pine floors. Where residents had once mailed letters and packages, including perhaps some who had known the truth about General Crawford, but remained silent out of fear or complicity. James found her there, the young deputy's face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with purpose. "Dr. Morgan told me what you found in the hidden collection," he said. All these years, Whitaker was keeping those battle plans right under everyone's noses. "He preserved the truth when everyone else wanted it buried," Abigail replied. "He and his son both sacrificed everything to ensure history would someday be protected from this kind of fraud." James nodded, settling onto a bench beside Abigail. "I always wondered why my great-great-grandfather never reconciled with his family after his reassignment, why he became so isolated in his later years. Now I understand he was carrying a burden too heavy to share. A burden that's finally being lifted. Because of what you helped me discover," Abigail said. "No, Miss Fletcher. Because you came to Oakridge when you did. Because you had the courage to keep looking when others would have walked away. Colonel Whitaker always said the truth would find its moment. You were meant to be here to find what he left behind." The idea struck Abigail with unexpected force that her path to Oakridge, seemingly driven by financial desperation and agricultural tragedy, might have had greater purpose. The bank foreclosure that had stripped away part of her former life had led her to this precise place at this precise moment in history, positioning her to uncover truth that had waited patiently for decades to be revealed. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Morgan, who entered the lobby with a tablet in hand. "The first authentication results are back from the evidence Whitaker preserved," she announced. "Modern technology applied to 150-year-old artifacts. It's remarkable what's possible now that wasn't when these items were suppressed." The results confirmed what the documentary evidence had suggested. Multiple paper analysis techniques not available when the original authentication was performed conclusively established the battle plans as belonging to a previously undocumented period within the Civil War. Carbon dating of organic materials found with the artifacts placed them precisely in the time frame Whitaker had theorized for General Crawford's brief command. "This is definitive," Morgan said, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine emotion. "After 150 years, we can prove not only that these artifacts are authentic, but that they belong to a general deliberately removed from historical records." "And the people responsible?" James asked. "Not just Alexander Caldwell's company, but 7 other prominent military officials whose names appear in Whitaker's records. Are any still active?" 3 descendants currently hold positions in government, including Victor Caldwell's current department. Their ancestors' authentication signatures appear on documents declaring these battle plans historically insignificant just days before the official dispute was reported. The implications were staggering. Not only could the original historical fraud be fully documented, but the subsequent cover-up potentially involving the current generation of military leadership could be exposed and prosecuted. The carefully constructed Caldwell legacy built on suppressing historical discoveries and maintained through intimidation, was crumbling under the weight of evidence preserved by two men who had never stopped believing in the importance of protecting historical integrity. As night fell over Oakridge, the post office became the centerpiece of a media frenzy. News vans lined the access road, reporters broadcasting live updates about the Crawford files and the shocking connections to the prominent Caldwell defense empire. The small Kentucky town that had harbored dark secrets for generations was now exposed in the harsh glare of national attention. Abigail watched from a lobby window as the scene unfolded below. In just 1 week, her life had transformed completely. She had come to Oakridge as a struggling farmer seeking affordable property, her future uncertain, her prospects limited by financial ruin. Now she stood at the center of what was rapidly becoming one of the most significant historical fraud investigations in recent American history. Dr. Morgan joined her at the window, her face illuminated by the flashing lights of news cameras below. The National Historical Association director called personally. This investigation is now their top priority. We're bringing in additional resources, establishing a dedicated task force focused on historical fraud. Because of the Caldwell connection? Abigail asked. Partly, Morgan nodded. But also because the evidence suggests this fraud may connect to similar historical suppressions in other regions. Whitaker's notes reference other contractors who created comparable cover-ups during the same time period. This could be bigger than just Oakridge. The possibility was both horrifying and compelling that the systematic erasure of General Crawford might have inspired similar acts elsewhere, or perhaps been inspired by them. That the corruption centered around Caldwell defense systems might extend beyond Civil War artifacts, connecting powerful figures across the military world in a network of profit and historical betrayal. What happens now? Abigail asked. Authentication. Reports are being prepared for federal prosecutors. Victor Caldwell and executives at 3 other defense firms are being called to testify. The National Historical Association is personally reviewing the case to ensure everything is handled properly. There will be no mistakes, no technicalities that allow them to escape justice. Morgan paused, studying Abigail with newfound respect. None of this would have happened without you. Your decision to buy this post office, your curiosity about the safe, your courage in protecting the evidence when the Caldwells came for it. You've changed the course of American military history. Abigail hadn't thought of it that way. She had been focused on survival, on finding affordable property after losing part of her farm. The post office had been a desperate last resort, not a deliberate choice to uncover long-buried secrets. I was just trying to start over, she said quietly. To find a place where I could rebuild after losing my crops and nearly losing my family's land. Sometimes our lowest moments lead us exactly where we need to be, Morgan replied. Your financial hardship brought you to Oakridge at precisely the moment when those files needed to be found after the post office's closure, but before the property could be acquired by the Caldwells. The observation resonated deeply with Abigail. Throughout her life, she had sought control and stability through her farming career, her careful land management, her meticulous financial planning. The drought that had destroyed her crops had seemed like the ultimate failure, a complete loss of the security she had worked so hard to build. Yet that very loss had propelled her to Oakridge, to the county auction, to the abandoned post office, where evidence had waited patiently for decades to be discovered. Had her life proceeded according to plan, had the rains come on time, had her crops thrived, had her finances remained stable, she would never have found herself in position to uncover the truth about General Crawford. Colonel Whitaker spent his life protecting these files, Abigail reflected, sacrificing his own happiness to ensure that truth would someday come to light. He never knew if his efforts would matter in the end. That's the nature of faith, James said, joining them at the window. Not religious faith necessarily, but faith in history. Faith that doing the right thing matters even when results aren't guaranteed. Colonel Whitaker and Samuel believed that truth would eventually find its moment. And you were the moment it was waiting for. As the three stood watching the scene below, a convoy of official vehicles pulled up in front of the post office. Agents and National Historical Association representatives emerged, followed by officials from the Smithsonian Institution. Among them was a composed woman in her early 60s, Catherine Davis, the great-granddaughter whose ancestor had died investigating the original fraud. She asked to see the building, Morgan explained, to stand in the place where the truth about her great-grandfather's death was preserved all these years. Abigail felt a profound connection to this woman who had lived her entire life under the shadow of unanswered questions. Without exchanging a word, she understood Catherine's need to see where Colonel Whitaker had kept faith with her family, preserving evidence when official channels had failed. I'll meet her, Abigail decided. She should know the whole story, not just about the evidence, but about the men who protected it. About James and Samuel Whitaker, who never forgot what happened to her great-grandfather. As Abigail descended the stairs to greet Catherine Davis, she felt a sense of purpose unlike anything she had experienced before. The post office that had been her last resort, her desperate attempt at finding affordable property, had become something far more significant, a place of reckoning, of long-delayed justice, of truth finally emerging after decades in darkness. Abigail Fletcher had come to Oakridge seeking only shelter. She had found meaning instead. 3 months after the discovery in the Oakridge Post Office safe, Abigail Fletcher stood in the Grand Hall of the National Historical Association headquarters in Washington, watching as the Director General addressed a room packed with journalists, academic officials, and museum representatives from around the country. The investigation that had begun in a small Kentucky post office had expanded into one of the most significant historical fraud cases in modern American history. Sunlight streamed through the ornate windows, illuminating the faces of people who had traveled from across the nation to witness this historic moment. Today, we announce formal sanctions against Victor Caldwell and executives from 3 other major defense firms, the Director General declared, her voice steady and resolute. These sanctions cover the 1876 General Crawford suppression as well as conspiracy, falsification of provenance, and historical fraud charges spanning more than a century. Abigail felt Catherine Davis squeeze her hand as the formal announcement continued. Over the past months, they had formed a bond that transcended ordinary friendship, the finder of truth and the woman who had waited a lifetime to receive it, united by their shared commitment to historical integrity, long delayed. We also acknowledge that these sanctions would not have been possible without the extraordinary efforts of 2 men, Colonel James Whitaker and Lieutenant Samuel Whitaker, who preserved critical evidence at great personal cost when official channels failed. Their dedication to historical truth, and Ms. Abigail Fletcher's discovery of their carefully hidden files, has finally exposed a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of Civil War historiography. The press conference continued with technical details of the investigation, but Abigail found her mind drifting to the remarkable journey of the past 3 months. What had begun with her desperate purchase of an abandoned post office had evolved into something far more profound, a reckoning with buried secrets, a challenge to entrenched power, and ultimately a restoration of integrity to historical records meant to preserve America's cultural heritage. The weeks following her discovery had been a whirlwind of activity as the national investigation expanded. The hidden evidence from the post office had revealed connections to other suppressed discoveries across multiple military campaigns, all bearing similar authentication signatures, all somehow linked to contractors within the Caldwell network of companies. The fraud had not been merely the theft or misidentification of artifacts, had been a systematic erasure of historical evidence that challenged established narratives, allowing private collectors to acquire pieces of immense historical significance. while the academic world remained unaware of their true importance. More disturbing still were the logs Abigail had found hidden in Whitaker's collection. Detailed accounts of researchers who had questioned these authentications before being silenced through career destruction, forced resignations, or in cases like Captain Davis, suspicious accidents. For Abigail personally, the aftermath had brought unexpected purpose. Her background in agricultural record-keeping and practical problem-solving had made her an invaluable consultant to the investigation, helping analysts understand the postal cataloging system and how it had been compromised. What had begun as professional courtesy had evolved into a formal position with the newly created Historical Authentication Oversight Division, applying her expertise to evaluating preservation protocols nationwide. The post office itself had transformed as well. Rather than the burden she had initially feared, the property had become both her home and the centerpiece of her new life. With the investigation bringing national attention to Oakridge, grants and donations had poured in to restore the historic facility, not just as a working museum again, but as a training center for authentication specialists, a living memorial to the Whitakers' dedication, and a testament to the power of truth preserved against overwhelming odds. "I never imagined this place could become something so meaningful," Robert mused, settling into a chair in Abigail's living room. "When the post office closed and the building sat empty, I thought it would eventually be demolished, another piece of Oakridge's history lost. Instead, it's become a place where history is preserved and examined," Abigail said, "where past authentication failures can finally be addressed." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Catherine Davis stood on the threshold, having flown back from Washington on the same flight as Abigail. "Just wanted to say good night," she said, her quiet dignity a testament to years spent fighting for her great-grandfather's vindication. "And to thank you again." In the 3 months since they'd met, Catherine had become not just a friend, but a partner in the investigation, her legal background proving invaluable as the case expanded. Her decision to accept a position with the new Historical Authentication Oversight Division meant she would be spending significant time in Oakridge as the training facility took shape. "Tomorrow's the big day," Abigail reminded her. "The first group of museum curators arrives for training." Catherine nodded. 150 years after my great-grandfather questioned those authentications, museum professionals will finally learn the truth about what happened. There's a symmetry to that I find deeply satisfying. After she departed, Robert studied Abigail with grandfatherly affection. "You found more than justice here," he observed. "You found a new path forward." Abigail couldn't deny it. What had begun as a desperate purchase had evolved into something she could never have anticipated, not just a home, but a purpose that utilized her knowledge in service to historical integrity. "Sometimes the worst moment of your life is just the beginning of something better," she said, thinking of the drought that had initially seemed like the end of everything. The next morning, as sunrise illuminated the restored post office facade, Abigail stood on the front steps, watching as a tour bus made its approach. The first contingent of museum professionals, 20 men and women selected for specialized training in authentication protocols, would be arriving momentarily. Catherine joined her, professional in a tailored suit, but with excitement evident in her eyes. "They're arriving at the exact same time my great-grandfather first came to Oakridge," she noted, checking her watch. 7:42 a.m., another one of those symmetries that makes this feel like completion of a circle. As the bus pulled up, Abigail reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this moment: the devastating drought, the failed crops, the financial ruin that followed, the bank's pressure that had seemed like the ultimate failure. Each painful step had positioned her precisely where she needed to be, to uncover truth that had waited 150 years to be revealed. Had any single element been different, had she found another property, had she ignored the safe, had she lacked The courage to stand against the Caldwell's justice might never have come for the historical personnel who had been silenced for questioning fraudulent authentications. Later that day, after welcoming the curators and giving them a tour of the facility, Abigail retreated to what had once been the postmaster's office, now her personal workspace. It contained a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Colonel Whitaker. The precise handwriting filled pages with observations about the General Crawford suppression and the authentications that followed, not just technical details, but his personal struggle with knowledge he could share with no one. One entry from 1887 stood out. Another anniversary of Davis's death today. 10 years since that accident, and still no justice. The Army has officially closed the case, though they use the term ongoing assessment to avoid admitting defeat. Only Samuel and I know how thoroughly Caldwell has compromised the system. Sometimes I wonder if our efforts will ever matter, if these files I've preserved will ever see the light of day. Faith without evidence is hard to maintain year after year. Abigail felt a profound connection to the man who had written those words, a man who had persevered, despite having no guarantee his actions would ever make a difference. James Whitaker had continued documenting falsifications, preserving evidence, protecting truth long after others had surrendered to the seeming inevitability of the Caldwell's power. His patient faith had finally been rewarded, though he hadn't lived to see it. The truth he and Samuel had protected had emerged at last, bringing answers to families who had waited generations for justice. The defense contractors who had believed themselves untouchable were facing consequences decades in the making. As afternoon light filtered through the newly restored windows, Abigail prepared for the first training session with the museum professionals. The lobby, once a symbol of abandonment and decay, now bustled with purposeful activity as authentication experts, analysts, and preservation specialists collaborated to ensure the falsifications of the past would never be repeated. Catherine Davis had become a central figure in the program, her intimate knowledge of the case and legal expertise making her an invaluable resource. Now a senior advisor to the Authentication Oversight Division, she had dedicated herself to creating systems that would prevent defense contractors from ever again suppressing historical discoveries for profit. "I brought coffee," Catherine announced, arriving with a tray of cups from Oakridge's recently opened Cafe, one of several new businesses that had appeared as the town experienced unexpected renewal. The national attention brought by the case had transformed Oakridge from a struggling rural community into a place of historical and strategic importance, drawing visitors, researchers, and museum personnel from across the country. Perfect timing, Abigail welcomed her. "The team from the Smithsonian is arriving this morning to help us integrate the training program with their new authentication protocols." As they settled into work, Abigail marveled at how naturally she had adapted to this new role, applying her knowledge not to farm management, but to ensuring the integrity of museum authentication systems. The skills she had developed throughout her life had found unexpected application, bringing meaning to experience that had seemed irrelevant after financial hardship forced the sale of part of her family's farm. By mid-morning, the post office hummed with collaborative energy. In the main lobby, curators studied the historical fraud while developing new safeguards. In the preservation laboratory, technicians installed advanced authentication systems designed to prevent falsification. Throughout the facility, experts in various fields contributed specialized knowledge to a historical initiative designed to protect America's most vulnerable artifacts. A call from Dr. Morgan brought momentous news. "Victor Caldwell has agreed to cooperate with investigators," she reported. "Facing overwhelming evidence and abandoned by political allies, he's begun providing information about other suppressed discoveries that we haven't yet uncovered." "How extensive is it?" Catherine asked, her voice tense with the implications. "He's implicated 9 other defense contractors," Morgan replied, "including 4 currently working on major museum acquisitions. This is expanding beyond anything we anticipated." The revelation confirmed what Colonel Whitaker had suspected a century earlier, that the corruption centered around the Caldwell defense empire extended far beyond Oakridge, connecting powerful contractors across the industry in a network of mutual protection and shared culpability. The suppression of General Crawford had been merely the visible portion of a deeper system that had operated with impunity for generations. As Abigail shared this update with the training team, she noticed something remarkable in the faces around her, not just satisfaction at Caldwell's cooperation, but a profound sense of vindication for the museum professionals who had spent decades being told that questioning prominent contractors was career suicide. For the families who had lost loved ones to suspicious accidents when they raised concerns about authentication discrepancies. For everyone who had ever suspected the truth but lacked the evidence to prove it, this moment represented something beyond ordinary justice. It was restoration in its truest sense, not just of artifacts or provenance, but of faith itself, faith in the possibility that no corruption, however entrenched, could permanently suppress what was true, if enough people refused to surrender to intimidation and influence. That evening, as sunset painted Oakridge's landscape in golden light, Abigail stood on the post office's newly restored steps, watching the community that had become her home. Children played in the recently renovated town park while residents patronized newly opened businesses. Shops that had been boarded up months earlier now displayed help-wanted signs and fresh paint. The town was healing, not just from the recent revelations about authentication fraud, but from decades of economic decline that had slowly eroded its foundations. By confronting the truth about suppressed discoveries, Oakridge had begun reclaiming its identity from the powerful few who had controlled its narrative for generations. Robert joined Abigail on the steps, his weathered hands cradling a cup of tea. "James would be proud of what this place has become," he said, gazing at the facility that had been his workplace for nearly 4 decades. Samuel, too. They protected the truth when no one else would. And now look what's happened because of their faith. Abigail nodded, thinking of the men who had sacrificed so much without knowing if their efforts would ever matter. They understood something essential, that truth has value even when its victory isn't guaranteed. That preserving evidence of fraud is worthwhile even without certainty of justice. That integrity matters. A lesson for all of us, Robert agreed, especially in times when power seems insurmountable. As darkness fell over Oakridge, lights illuminated the post office's facade from within, casting a beacon across the surrounding landscape. The facility that had once represented Abigail's financial rock bottom had transformed into something she could never have imagined, a center for historical integrity, a monument to perseverance, and most unexpectedly, a true home. The foreclosure that had seemed like the end of her life had instead been a beginning. The desperate purchase that had represented her last financial resort had become the foundation of profound purpose. The abandoned post office that had offered merely affordable property had revealed its true value in the safe where truth had waited patiently for generations to be discovered. One afternoon a week later, Abigail stood in the restored lobby watching as a school group toured the facility. The children listened with rapt attention as Catherine explained how Colonel Whitaker had preserved evidence that everyone else had forgotten. "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is protect the truth," Catherine told them, "even when it seems like no one is paying attention. Even when you think it doesn't matter." A small girl raised her hand. "Did Colonel Whitaker know that someday Ms. Fletcher would find his hidden papers?" Catherine smiled. "No, he couldn't have known who would find them or when. He just believed that someday someone would understand their importance." "That took a lot of courage," the girl observed. "Yes," Catherine agreed. "Courage and faith, not in any particular outcome, but in the value of truth itself." After the children departed, Abigail found herself reflecting on the girl's question. Had Colonel Whitaker imagined someone like her, a struggling farmer driven to Oakridge by financial desperation, would be the one to finally uncover what he had hidden? Had he somehow sensed that his careful preservation would eventually bear fruit, even if not in his lifetime? Dr. Morgan's voice interrupted her thoughts. "The secretary of the Smithsonian just called," she announced, her expression a mixture of excitement and gravity. "The Crawford documents are being transferred to a permanent exhibition. They want you to speak at the opening ceremony." "Me?" Abigail asked, startled. "I'm just a farmer who stumbled onto something important." "That's exactly why they want you," Morgan explained. "Your story resonates with people. The farmer who lost everything, but discovered historical truth that powerful people had tried to bury. You remind people that ordinary citizens can change history by simply paying attention to what others have overlooked." The idea was intimidating, speaking before national leaders and historical experts. Her life had always been one of practical work, not public speaking. But perhaps that was precisely the point. The Whitakers had preserved evidence out of principle, with no guarantee it would ever matter. The least she could do was share their story with the world. "I'll do it," she decided. "Not for myself, but for Colonel Whitaker and Samuel. They deserve to have their dedication recognized." 2 weeks later, Abigail stood at a podium in the Smithsonian's American History Museum, facing an audience of historians, government officials, and media representatives. Behind her, in a specially designed display case, lay the Crawford documents battle. Plans and authentication records that had waited 150 years to be properly recognized. "I came to Oakridge seeking only storage space," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I had lost my crops to drought, my equipment to debt, and nearly my family's farm to foreclosure. The abandoned post office was all I could afford, a last-ditch effort to preserve what remained of my father's legacy." She paused, looking out at the attentive faces. "What I found instead was someone else's legacy, the careful preservation work of Colonel James Whitaker and his son Samuel. Two men who understood that some truths are worth protecting, even when there's no guarantee they'll ever be discovered. Two men who believe that historical accuracy matters, even when powerful interests seek to suppress it." Abigail gestured to the Crawford documents behind her. "These battle plans don't just tell us about a forgotten Civil War general. They tell us about the people who valued truth enough to protect it when everyone else had moved on. They remind us that integrity doesn't always bring immediate rewards. Sometimes it's a quiet act of faith, preserved in darkness, waiting for the right moment to emerge." As she concluded her remarks, Abigail noticed an elderly man in the front row, tears streaming down his face. Later she would learn he was Colonel Whitaker's great-grandson, who had grown up hearing family stories about his ancestors' obsession with authentication records, stories that had seemed like eccentric family lore until Abigail's discovery proved them true. That night, back in her hotel room, Abigail opened her laptop to a video call with Robert, who had stayed behind to oversee the training program. "You should see the Hartland County Register," he said, holding up the local newspaper. "Your speech is front-page news. Local farmer addresses Smithsonian on historic discovery. There's a picture of you at the podium." Abigail smiled, thinking of how the bank manager would react to seeing her name associated with national recognition rather than financial failure. "How are things at the farm?" she asked. With her new position at the authentication oversight division providing stable income, she had been able to begin recovering portions of her father's land, starting with the north field that had been lost to foreclosure. "Spring planting is underway," Robert reported. "The new irrigation system is installed, and the soil analysis came back promising. James and some volunteers from town helped repair the old barn. This place is coming back to life, just like the post office." The parallel wasn't lost on Abigail. Her father's farm and Colonel Whitaker's evidence, both restored after periods of abandonment, both finding new purpose after seeming loss. "Something else happened today," Robert continued, his expression brightening. "A letter arrived from the National Agricultural Heritage Foundation. They've selected Fletcher Family Farm for their historical preservation program. They're offering a substantial grant to restore the property as a working historical farm, place where traditional farming methods can be taught alongside modern sustainable practices." Abigail felt a surge of emotion. The farm that had seemed destined for corporate acquisition was instead being recognized for its historical significance, just as the Crawford documents had been. "There's a connection there," Robert observed, seeing her reaction. "Your father preserved traditional farming knowledge the same way Colonel Whitaker preserved historical evidence. Both understood the value of protecting something that might otherwise be lost." Later that week, as Abigail drove back to Kentucky, following the winding roads that led from Washington to Oakridge, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed her life. The drought that had threatened everything she valued had ultimately led her to a discovery that changed American military history. The financial collapse that had seemed like failure had positioned her to succeed in ways she could never have imagined. As she crested the hill overlooking Oakridge, the post office came into view, its restored facade now illuminated by tasteful lighting, its prominence in the community restored. Beside it, new businesses had opened in previously abandoned buildings, their fresh paint and bustling activity testament to the town's revitalization. In the distance she could see her father's farm, the newly plowed north field ready for planting, the repaired barn standing tall against the horizon. Two properties reclaimed from abandonment, two legacies preserved against overwhelming odds. Abigail Fletcher had come to Oakridge as a desperate farmer seeking affordable storage space. She had found instead a hidden truth that had waited generations to be revealed, a new purpose that utilized her unexpected skills, and a community that had embraced both her and the revelations she had uncovered. As she parked in front of the post office, Catherine emerged to greet her, followed by a group of museum curators who had just completed their training. "Welcome home," Catherine said, embracing her friend. "You've become quite the celebrity while you were away. The Historical Authentication Oversight Division has received requests from 12 more museums wanting to participate in the training program." "And the farm?" Abigail asked. "The irrigation system is operational," Catherine reported with a smile. "The north field is ready for planting, and the soil analysis showed excellent results. James and the volunteers completed the barn repairs yesterday. It's as if both properties were just waiting for the right person to restore them." As Abigail entered the post office that evening, she paused in the main lobby, now transformed into a training center where historical authenticators learned to recognize and prevent the kinds of fraud Colonel Whitaker had documented. The building that had represented her financial rock bottom had become the foundation of a national movement to protect historical integrity. On the wall hung a newly installed plaque dedicated to Colonel James Whitaker and Lieutenant Samuel Whitaker, who preserved truth when others sought to bury it, and to all who maintain faith in historical integrity, even when that faith goes unrewarded. Some buildings safeguard more than their apparent purpose. Some protect truths that can transform lives when finally revealed. Abigail ran her fingers across the plaque's surface, thinking of the men who had meticulously documented fraud without knowing if their efforts would ever matter. Men who had maintained faith in the value of truth, even when that faith seemed futile. Men whose dedication had finally found its moment, not in their lifetime but in hers. The drought that had destroyed her crops had led her to this precise place at this precise time, positioning her to discover evidence that had waited 150 years to be found. The financial hardship that had seemed like the end of everything had instead been the beginning of something extraordinary. Sometimes, Abigail reflected, our greatest losses lead us to our most meaningful discoveries. Sometimes the path forward requires letting go of what we thought we needed to find what we were meant to preserve. Sometimes truth waits patiently, in darkness, not for any particular person, but for someone who recognizes its value, someone who understands that some treasures are worth protecting, even if we never see them revealed in our lifetime. For Abigail Fletcher, the journey that had begun in desperation had led to unexpected purpose. The post office that had represented her last financial resort had become the center of a national movement to protect historical integrity. The farm that had seemed destined for corporate acquisition was now being preserved as living agricultural heritage. Two legacies saved her father's and Colonel Whitaker's, both finding new purpose through her unexpected intervention. Two treasures protected for future generations, not through grand design, but through the simple courage to recognize value where others saw only abandonment. As she made her way up to her apartment, Abigail paused at the window overlooking Oakridge's town square. The community that had welcomed her in desperation was now thriving because of what she had found. The truth that Colonel Whitaker had preserved had not only changed history, but had revitalized an entire town. Sometimes, she thought, our most desperate choices lead us precisely where we need to be. Sometimes what seems like the end of everything is merely the beginning of something we could never have imagined. Sometimes the lowest moments of our lives position us to discover truths that transform not just our own stories, but the stories of generations yet to come. Abigail Fletcher had come to Oakridge seeking only shelter. What she had found was a purpose that transcended her own needs, becoming the voice for a truth that had waited 150 years to be heard, and in the process, discovering that some losses, however painful, lead us to discoveries far more valuable than what we thought we were seeking. 6 months after the National Historical Association's formal announcement, Abigail Fletcher stood in the freshly harvested north field of her family farm, watching as the autumn sun cast long shadows across land that had nearly been lost forever. The rich Kentucky soil, once parched by drought and threatened by foreclosure, now yielded a bountiful harvest under her renewed stewardship. With her position at the Historical Authentication Oversight Division providing stable income, she had systematically reclaimed her father's legacy acre by acre, season by season. The field where she now stood had been the first piece recovered, its productivity restored through modern sustainable practices that honored traditional farming wisdom. In the distance stood the post office, its restored facade gleaming in the golden light. No longer abandoned or forgotten, it had become a national center for historical authentication training, drawing experts from museums and universities across the country. The building that had once represented her financial rock bottom now stood as a beacon of historical integrity and rural revitalization. Abigail's phone chimed with an incoming call. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan's name appeared on the screen. The Congressional hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday, Morgan announced without preamble. The committee wants you to testify about the discovery and its implications. Your perspective as the person who found the evidence is critical to their understanding of how deeply this fraud penetrated our historical institutions. I'm not sure what I can add that hasn't already been covered in the investigation reports, Abigail replied, running her hand through a handful of rich soil. You provide something the reports can't, the human element, Morgan explained. You show how ordinary citizens, paying attention to what's right in front of them, can uncover truths that powerful institutions have overlooked or deliberately buried. Your story resonates with people in ways that technical details never could. After ending the call, Abigail gazed across the farm that had been in her family for 3 generations. Her father had taught her to read the land to understand its needs, its potential, its history written in layers of soil and growth patterns. Those same observational skills had led her to notice the hidden safe in the post office basement, to recognize the significance of Colonel Whitaker's preserved evidence. Sometimes the abilities we develop for one purpose find unexpected application in another, she reflected. Her father's lessons in farm management had prepared her to uncover one of the most significant historical frauds in American military history. The following day, Abigail walked through downtown Oakridge, marveling at the transformation that had occurred in less than a year. New businesses occupied storefronts that had stood empty for decades. The Oakridge Historical Cafe had opened across from the post office, serving locally sourced food to the steady stream of visitors drawn by the Authentication Training Center. The abandoned hardware store had been renovated into a bed and breakfast to accommodate visiting scholars and museum professionals. What had once been a dying rural town was now vibrant with purpose and possibility. Employment had risen as local residents found jobs supporting the Authentication Center and serving the visitors it attracted. Property values had increased as abandoned buildings were restored and repurposed. The economic ripple effects of historical truth had transformed an entire community. Robert Wilson waved from the doorway of the newly established Oakridge Historical Society, where he served as volunteer director. The society's mission, preserving local history and promoting authentication integrity, had drawn enthusiastic support from residents who had discovered a new pride in their town's role in exposing historical fraud. "They're installing the permanent exhibit today," he called, gesturing for Abigail to join him. "The Crawford collection is finally coming home." Inside, museum professionals carefully arranged display cases containing reproductions of the battle plans Abigail had discovered, alongside photographs documenting Colonel Whitaker's preservation efforts and the subsequent investigation. The centerpiece, a life-sized recreation of the post office safe, stood in the middle of the gallery, its door perpetually open to reveal the truth that had waited 150 years to be discovered. "We've already sold out the opening reception," Robert reported proudly. "Governor's coming, along with the directors from the Smithsonian and the National Historical Association. Not bad for a town that most people couldn't find on a map a year ago." "It's hard to believe how much has changed," Abigail mused, watching the careful installation process. "Because of you," Robert said simply. "Because you paid attention to what everyone else had overlooked." Later that afternoon, Abigail met with Catherine Davis at the training center to review curriculum for the upcoming authentication workshop. Catherine had thrived in her role with the Oversight Division, developing protocols to prevent future suppression of historical evidence. The woman who had spent decades seeking justice for her great-grandfather had found her own purpose in ensuring others wouldn't face similar struggles. "The Department of Defense has approved our new authentication review process," Catherine announced, her eyes bright with satisfaction. "Every military artifact acquisition will now undergo independent verification before certification. It's the most significant reform in military historical preservation in 50 years. Your great-grandfather would be proud," Abigail observed. "Not just of the changes, but of your role in creating them." "As would Colonel Whitaker," Catherine replied. "Sometimes I wonder if he ever imagined how far-reaching the consequences would be when he decided to preserve those files. Did he know he was protecting not just one historical truth but potentially transforming the entire authentication system?" "I think he simply knew it was the right thing to do," Abigail said. "Sometimes that's enough, doing what's right in the moment, even without knowing where it might lead." The day before her scheduled testimony in Washington, Abigail received an unexpected visitor at the farm. Manager Browning from Hartland Agricultural Bank arrived in his immaculate sedan, looking decidedly uncomfortable as he made his way across the recently harvested field. "Quite a transformation," he observed, surveying the thriving farm that had been on the verge of foreclosure less than a year earlier. "I've been following your story in the news. Quite remarkable, from struggling farmer to national historical figure." Abigail said nothing, waiting for him to reveal the purpose of his visit. "The bank has been reviewing its agricultural loan policies," Browning continued, his discomfort growing under her steady gaze. In light of recent events, we're establishing a new program for farms facing temporary setbacks due to environmental factors. Your situation has illuminated certain shortcomings in our approach. He handed her a folder. We'd like to offer you a position on our advisory board, helping develop more sustainable policies for agricultural lending. Your perspective would be valuable in creating programs that protect family farms during hardship, without compromising their long-term viability. Abigail accepted the folder, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not just an acknowledgement of her changed circumstances but a tacit admission that the bank's aggressive foreclosure policies had nearly destroyed something of immense value. The very institution that had dismissed her as a failure now sought her counsel in reshaping its approach to family farms. "I'll consider it," she said simply, "after I return from Washington." The congressional hearing room buzzed with anticipation. As Abigail took her seat at the witness table, cameras tracked her every move, broadcasting the proceedings to a national audience. The committee members, representatives from both parties, regarded her with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. "Miss Fletcher," the chairwoman began, "you've been described as an accidental historian, someone who stumbled upon evidence of extraordinary significance without any background in the field. Could you describe for the committee how you came to purchase the Oakridge Post Office and subsequently discovered the Crawford documents?" Drawing a deep breath, Abigail recounted her journey, the drought that had devastated her crops, the financial hardship that followed, the desperate search for affordable property that led her to the county auction. She described her initial interest in the post office as purely practical, a place to store equipment and possibly live while rebuilding her farming operation. "I had no intention of making historical discoveries," she explained. "I was simply trying to survive financially after losing a significant portion of my family's farm." The safe in the basement storage room was an unexpected feature of a property I purchased out of necessity, not choice. "Yet you recognize the significance of what you found," another representative observed. "Many people might have ignored the safe or dismissed its contents as irrelevant once opened." "My father taught me that value isn't always obvious at first glance," Abigail replied. "As a farmer, I learned to look beneath the surface to see potential where others might see only failure or insignificance. The documents in that safe clearly mattered to someone. Colonel Whitaker had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve them. That alone suggested they deserved careful attention." For the next 2 hours, Abigail answered questions about the discovery, the authentication process, and the subsequent investigation. She described the confrontation with Victor Caldwell and his attempt to recover or destroy the evidence before its significance could be verified. Throughout her testimony, she emphasized not her own role but the dedication of the Whitakers, who had protected truth for generations without recognition or reward. The real heroes of this story died long before these documents were discovered, she told the committee. Colonel James Whitaker and Lieutenant Samuel Whitaker preserved evidence of historical fraud at great personal cost, with no guarantee their efforts would ever matter. They maintained faith in the value of truth, even when that faith seemed futile. As the hearing concluded, the chairwoman asked a final question. "Ms. Fletcher, based on your experience, what lessons should we draw about the protection of historical integrity in our institutions?" Abigail considered her response carefully. "I believe we've learned 3 important lessons from this case. First, that historical truth can be vulnerable to powerful interests, economic, political, or personal. Second, that conventional safeguards may fail when those interests exert pressure on the very institutions designed to protect historical integrity." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But the third and perhaps most important lesson is that truth has remarkable persistence. Despite generations of deliberate suppression, despite the influence of the Caldwell family across multiple institutions, these documents survived." Colonel Whitaker's faith that someday someone would recognize The value of what he preserved was ultimately justified. A hopeful perspective, the chairwoman noted, especially given the systematic nature of the fraud you uncovered. Hope isn't passive wishful thinking, Abigail clarified. Colonel Whitaker didn't just hope someone would eventually discover the truth, he actively preserved evidence to make that discovery possible. He created the conditions for truth to persist, even when he couldn't control when or how it would emerge. After the hearing, Abigail stood on the steps of the Capitol building, surrounded by reporters asking for additional comments. She answered briefly, emphasizing again the role of the Whitakers in preserving evidence when official channels had failed. As the media scrum dispersed, Abigail noticed a distinguished elderly man waiting patiently at the edge of the crowd. When the reporters had gone, he approached her with dignity that suggested military background. "Miss Fletcher," he said, extending his hand. "I'm William Crawford Thompson, great-great-grandson of General Thomas Crawford. I wanted to thank you personally for restoring my ancestor to his rightful place in history." Abigail shook his hand, struck by the realization that her discovery had not just exposed fraud, but had reunited a family with its lost heritage. For generations, the Crawfords had been deprived of their connection to American military history, their ancestors' contribution erased by corporate greed and institutional corruption. "Your family must have wondered why there was no official record of the general," she observed. "Family stories persisted," Thompson confirmed. "Tales of a distinguished ancestor who led troops at a critical battle near Chancellorsville. But without official documentation, they were dismissed as fabrications or exaggerations. My father spent decades searching military archives for any mention of General Crawford, only to be told repeatedly that no such officer existed." He paused, emotion briefly overcoming his military bearing. He died believing his family's oral history was flawed, that generations of Crawfords had perpetuated a comforting myth rather than actual history. He never knew that the evidence existed, preserved in that post office safe, waiting to be discovered. Their conversation continued over dinner at a nearby restaurant, where Thompson shared family photographs and letters that had been preserved despite the official erasure of General Crawford from military records. The parallels to Colonel Whitaker's preservation efforts were striking. Both families had maintained faith in historical truth, even when institutional forces denied or suppressed it. "My father would have been overjoyed to see this day," Thompson sighed, carefully returning a faded photograph of the general to a protective sleeve. "To know that history has been corrected, that his ancestors' service has finally been acknowledged." "Colonel Whitaker would feel the same way," Abigail replied. "He died believing the truth might never emerge, but he protected it anyway because he understood its value even if he would never see its recognition in his lifetime." As they parted that evening, Thompson presented Abigail with a small wooden box containing General Crawford's personal compass, a family heirloom, passed down through generations despite his official non-existence in military records. "This belongs in the Oakridge Historical Society," he said. "A small token of our family's gratitude for your role in restoring our heritage." Upon returning to Kentucky, Abigail found Oakridge transformed once again. News of her congressional testimony had brought a fresh wave of attention to the small town. Tour buses lined the main street as visitors arrived to see the post office, where historical truth had been preserved against overwhelming odds. The Historical Society's permanent exhibit, Preserving Truth, the Crawford Legacy, had opened to record attendance. Local businesses reported unprecedented sales as tourism boosted the rural economy. What had begun as one farmer's desperate purchase of an abandoned building had evolved into economic revitalization for an entire community. More meaningful than the economic impact, however, was the restoration of the town's self-image. Once seen as a dying rural outpost, Oakridge had discovered a new identity as a center for historical authentication and integrity. Residents who had previously sought opportunities elsewhere were returning, drawn by both improved economic prospects and a renewed sense of community purpose. At the farm, Abigail found Robert Wilson and James waiting with a proposal that would further integrate her two worlds, the agricultural heritage she had fought to preserve and the historical authentication work that had transformed her life. The Agricultural Heritage Foundation wants to establish a demonstration project here, James explained, spreading architectural plans across her kitchen table. Combining traditional farming methods with modern sustainable practices while documenting the history of family farming in the region. They're proposing an educational center adjacent to the working farm, Robert added. A place where visitors can learn about both agricultural techniques and the history of rural communities, like Oakridge. It's perfect, Abigail said, studying the integration of historical and agricultural elements in the design. A way to honor both my father's legacy and Colonel Whitaker's. 2 weeks later, Abigail stood in the post office lobby, now transformed into a state-of-the-art authentication training facility, watching as Catherine led a workshop on document preservation techniques. Museum professionals from across the country listened attentively as she demonstrated methods for identifying fraudulent provenance claims techniques developed in response to the Crawford case. The most sophisticated frauds succeed because they exploit institutional assumptions, Catherine was explaining. They rely on our tendency to accept documentation from recognized authorities without sufficient independent verification. Colonel Whitaker recognized this vulnerability 150 years ago, which is why he preserved evidence outside official channels. A participant raised his hand. But isn't working outside institutional frameworks risky? Doesn't it potentially undermine the very systems we're trying to protect? Excellent question, Catherine acknowledged. Colonel Whitaker tried working within the system first, following proper protocols, reporting his concerns to superiors, documenting discrepancies through official channels. Only when those efforts were systematically blocked did he create an alternative preservation method. She gestured toward the replica of the safe displayed prominently in the lobby. His actions weren't a rejection of institutional authority, but a recognition of its temporary corruption. He preserved evidence precisely so the system could eventually correct itself, which is exactly what has happened, though much later than he might have hoped. After the workshop concluded, Abigail joined Catherine for coffee at the historical cafe across the street. The authentication protocols we've developed are being implemented at 17 major museums, Catherine reported proudly. The Smithsonian has committed to reviewing its entire military collection using our verification standards. This is extending far beyond the Crawford case now. Just as Colonel Whitaker would have wanted, Abigail observed. Yes, but with one significant difference, Catherine added. He worked alone, isolated by his knowledge of corruption at the highest levels. We're creating collaborative systems with multiple independent verification points, making it far more difficult for any single authority to suppress inconvenient truths. As they spoke, Abigail noticed Manager Browning entering the cafe, accompanied by representatives from the Agricultural Heritage Foundation. The meeting to discuss the farm's new educational center would begin shortly, bridging her two worlds in ways she could never have anticipated a year earlier. Sometimes I can't believe how much has changed, she confessed to Catherine. Last year at this time, I was fighting to save my farm from foreclosure, watching crops die in the fields, seeing my father's legacy slipping away. I bought that post office because it was all I could afford, a desperate last attempt to salvage something from financial ruin. And now? Catherine prompted. Now I'm helping design new authentication protocols and developing an agricultural heritage center. The bank that nearly foreclosed on my family's farm wants my advice on sustainable lending practices. The town that was dying is thriving because of historical tourism. None of it makes sense if you look at where I started. It makes perfect sense, Catherine countered. You recognized value where others saw only abandonment in both the post office and your struggling farm. You paid attention to details others overlooked. You respected evidence that powerful people wanted buried. Those same qualities made you both a good farmer and an important historical figure. That evening, Abigail walked the boundaries of her farm, watching as sunset painted the fields in golden light. The north section, once lost to foreclosure, now reclaimed and productive, stretched toward the horizon. The old barn, recently restored with help from community volunteers, stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. In the distance, the post office was illuminated from within, its windows glowing as museum professionals continued their authentication. Training into the evening hours. The building that had represented her financial desperation now stood as a beacon of historical integrity and community renewal. Abigail Fletcher had come to Oakridge seeking only affordable property, a place to store equipment while rebuilding her shattered farming operation. She had found instead a hidden truth that had waited generations to be revealed, a new purpose that utilized her unexpected skills, and a community that had embraced both her and the revelation she had uncovered. The drought that had threatened everything she valued had ultimately led her to a discovery that changed American military history. The financial collapse that had seemed like failure had positioned her to succeed in ways she could never have imagined. As darkness fell over Kentucky fields that had sustained her family for generations, Abigail reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed her life. Colonel Whitaker had preserved evidence without knowing if it would ever matter. Her father had maintained farming traditions without knowing if they would survive economic pressures. Both had maintained faith in the value of what they protected, even without certainty of outcome. She had inherited both legacies, the farmer's patience and the historian's persistence, the agricultural skills that connected her to the land, and the observational abilities that had led her to notice what others had overlooked. The courage to face financial ruin and the determination to protect truth once discovered. The post office safe had contained more than battle plans and authentication records. It had held faith itself, Colonel Whitaker's belief that truth, properly preserved, would eventually find its moment, even if he would never witness its emergence. His century-old act of preservation had awaited the arrival of someone who would recognize its significance, someone whose life circumstances had positioned her to notice what generations of others had missed. From her kitchen window, Abigail could see both the illuminated post office and her productive fields, two legacies preserved against overwhelming odds, two treasures protected for future generations. The abandoned building that had represented her financial rock bottom had become the foundation of historical authentication reform. The struggling farm that bankers had dismissed as failing was now a model for agricultural heritage preservation. As she prepared for the next day's meeting about the educational center, Abigail thought of the compass William Crawford Thompson had given her, an heirloom preserved through generations, despite official denial of the general's existence. Like Colonel Whitaker's hidden files, it represented faith in historical truth, even when institutional forces aligned against it. Like her father's farming methods, it embodied knowledge passed down despite economic pressures toward forgetting. The compass would have a place of honor in the Oakridge Historical Society, alongside the reproduction of the Crawford battle plans and photographs of Colonel Whitaker. Together, they would tell a story not just of military history, but of preservation itself. The quiet courage required to protect truth when recognition seems impossible. The patient faith needed to maintain integrity when rewards remain uncertain. Abigail Fletcher had come to Oakridge as a desperate farmer seeking affordable storage space. She had found instead a hidden truth that had waited generations to be revealed, a new purpose that utilized her unexpected skills, and a community that had embraced both her and the revelation she had uncovered. As stars appeared above the Kentucky landscape, Abigail thought of Colonel Whitaker's journal entry, questioning if his efforts would ever matter. If James could see the post office now alive with purpose, filled with dedicated professionals committed to securing history's most vulnerable truths, a beacon of integrity for those who had waited generations for answers, he would know with certainty that his faith had not been in vain. Some discoveries change more than history. Some transform the discoverer, the community, and the very nature of what integrity means in a world where profit too often prevails over truth. The abandoned post office and its hidden safe had offered precisely such a discovery, a reminder that no truth, however deeply buried, is beyond reaching when the right person arrives at the right moment to uncover what others have fought to conceal. The humble building that had once been Abigail's last resort now stood as a testament to the power of perseverance, to the possibility that our greatest losses might lead us to our most meaningful purpose, and to the enduring value of protecting truth, not just for ourselves but for all who come after. For in the end, Abigail had discovered something far more precious than a Civil War general's battle plans. She had found that even in our darkest moments, when all seems lost, we may be standing on the threshold of our greatest contribution if we have the courage to turn the key, open the safe, and bring long-buried truth into the light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us